I think great to be here and for sort of having me here. I think in terms of kind of the books that I like to read, I do read lot of nonfiction essentially, and yeah, I think biographies and autobiographies make for interesting reading in terms of understanding, how people have had journeys and kind of lessons that you can pick up from that. I guess most of us, if not all of us, essentially know about Indra Nooyi. I think she's been one of the most celebrated corporate leaders, in the recent past. In fact, she is the first woman of color and immigrant to actually lead a Fortune 50 organization. And her tenure was superlative in every facet that you could look at in terms of delivering financial returns, in terms of redrawing the entire philosophy or direction of Pepsi in terms of orienting it to performance with a purpose, as she called it. And, as an Indian American, obviously also a matter of great pride for somebody to, someone from our kind of a community to sort of reach the heights that she reached. So I think all in all, a fairly kind of rare and remarkable journey. And I think the way I've sort of structured it is on 4-5 takeaways or reflections that resonated with me, as I thought about it as an individual and as a professional also. Right. So yeah, I think diving right in, possibly the first thing that I think struck me about Indra's journey is how she essentially, as a generalist, managed to reach kind of the very top of the corporate hierarchy. Right. If you look at her career trajectory, it's fairly checkered. She started selling textiles in Madras, then moved into the States for an MBA with Yale, got into management consulting with BCG, moved through to Motorola, into electronics, then into industrial goods with ABB, and eventually, finding her way to Pepsi. And while she did this, she did a plethora of roles. It was, as I said, consulting, corporate strategy, planning, finance, and then eventually, M&A, and then eventually becoming a CEO. So I think, especially for a lot of people who kind of start their careers and debate, is it being a specialist or a generalist? I think it makes for an interesting case. And I think she also calls out in her books at various points why being an outsider actually helped her cause. Because I think the key skill that she had was, you put me in any context, I can create a framework to understand what is driving value in a given business. And that's the method, right? So the context is less relevant than the method. I think the method holds true, and hence, whichever scenario that she was put in, she was able to navigate it fairly well. So I think, unlike a lot of typical journeys that you see where people build deep expertise in a given function or a given industry, here's a very strong case how somebody has navigated diversity and yet kind of managed to reach to the very top. So I think that sort of was a key thing that I took away from her journey. I think this is possibly my favorite takeaway in terms of what I went through. And we are with Rob, and I think the biggest takeaway is that I think Indra is a voracious reader, right? In her own words, whenever I had to tackle a big idea, I hit the books. And I think it is a recurring theme throughout the entire, kind of journey that she has called out. In fact, she's gone on to the extent of saying that she had to approve a 1.5 billion enterprise software capex project, and she didn't know a thing about it. So the first thing that she did for I think good 2 to 3 months is to read up on every available book that was on that particular topic to understand enterprise systems, understand software, and go to the nitty-gritties of it. And that's how she came to her conclusion in terms of being able to evaluate something so technical, right? It's also interesting. A lot of times we think that the organization should invest in our learning and our development. Here's a person who actually hired professors to come and teach her about automobiles and physics and electronics when she went into an industrial goods company like ABB, where her clients were super specialized companies, and she didn't have the faintest clue in terms of some of those places, right? So she actually hired, as as also called out on the slide, that professors who would come and teach her twice a week and sort of educate her on this process. And this is at a stage when she was a fairly reasonable professional. She was not a management trainee or anything like that, right? So I think she actually consciously invested in her learning, and I truly think that this was her superpower, because if you kind of look at it, I think she honed her kind of research routines in her early days as a consultant, but she ensured that she sort of stuck to it in every stage of her kind of corporate journey. And I think that's the way she was able to bridge the gap, irrespective of which context that she was put in. Forget bridging the gap, in fact, actually doing a fairly superlative job, irrespective of where she was put. I think, this is something, as I said, I kind of resonate with personally a lot as well, in terms of, when you don't know something, go read about it, and, you will definitely be wiser than what you were earlier, right? So I think that's a fairly kind of strong theme that kind of comes out and resonates with me. I think another kind of important facet, and I think this is especially true because of women in corporate roles, and they tend to face more headwinds than men, and I think that's a reality. I think the kind of role that mentors typically play, right? And this is something which she has kind of described in fairly vivid detail, in her book. I think her somebody who was 3 levels her senior in her first company, where she was in a sales role, textile sales role, is a British gentleman by the name Norman Wade. He was one of her strongest sponsors and supporters, and he saw the spark in her very early on, and knew that she was meant for bigger things. And she did phenomenally well in the brief sales stint that she had, and she actually got the offer to join Yale, right? And as you can imagine, this is late 70s, early 80s, not the time and age of today, where it's very normal for kind of women to go out abroad and kind of study and all of that. And there was a lot of debate with her family whether they should kind of let her go, and whether it's the right choice, so on and so forth. So here was a super boss who really valued her, in fact, who was even happy to offer her kind of a double promotion, if you will, knowing her potential. But I think he realized what this opportunity could mean for her. And he eventually told her that possibly this is the right move, because you should move to the US, and it will really unlock the kind of potential that you have, to the extent that he also spoke to her family, her parents, I think, to somewhere give them the reassurance that this is the right choice for your daughter. And her family had so much trust on him as her well-wisher and as her mentor, that they actually kind of acquiesced to that request, saying that, yeah, I think this is the right choice. And it was not that they were ever blocking, but I think the presence of somebody so strong vouching for her sort of really made the case very, very strong. She also talks about this German manager called Gerhard, whom she worked with in Motorola. He was a guy who had churned through, I think, 3-4 subordinates in less than a year. Very hard taskmaster to work with, very demanding. At the same time, somebody who was very good at his job. And she obviously delivered to her potential, and even beyond, to a stage that when Gerhard actually left Motorola and joined ABB in a different role, and he was looking for people, his mandate to the recruiters was, find me somebody like Indra Nooyi. That was the brief. So the recruiters didn't have the faintest idea now what does find somebody like Indra Nooyi actually mean. So they contacted Indra to understand what she's all about, and they actually got her on board to do interviews while she was in Motorola for candidates for ABB. It was that kind of a stretch, and eventually Gerhard ended up convincing her to join ABB as well, right? Because he knew how good she was, and she stayed on in the company for a fairly decent length of time. Then I think Gerhard had moved on for his own reasons, and eventually the arrangement didn't work out for her, and then she left. But I think larger point being that I think how mentors can sort of really supercharge you and take you places where you otherwise may not reach. And I think especially true in the case of women, and I think they need that active sponsorship. And I think, notwithstanding how good Indra was any which way in terms of her brilliance and her capabilities, I think these two gentlemen did play, very, very significant role in, in her whole kind of career and journey arc. So I think that's something, which also stayed with me, in the course of the book, right? I think something not very pleasant. I think most of us know it consciously, subconsciously, but I think fact of life is that gender bias is a very real thing, and it while we all know it, I think what made it a bit more real for me was to understand it from the perspective of somebody like Indra, who possibly, you can't think of too many more powerful people in powerful roles than her. And if she had to face, gender bias, then, what does that really say about the kind of environment that somebody has to navigate, right? And she essentially talks about very, very small instances, right? These are not big things, but, what we call as unconscious bias, right? It's embedded so deeply in people's mindsets. So, as head of PepsiCo, she lands in Mexico with a team of guys, and the folks out there greet everybody. Hi, Mr. X. Hi, Mr. Y. And when it comes to Indra, it's hi, Indra, right? And they're addressing the CEO of PepsiCo while they are at it, right? She talks about how people in board meetings found it okay to interrupt her mid-sentence while she was actually talking. And they wouldn't do that with male colleagues, right? Just because, again, it was a woman. She talks about how for men, a lot of times using, unparliamentary language and using strong words is often seen as a example of their kind of aggression or assertiveness and all of that. And yet, when it comes to women, it actually kind of plays very, very differently, right? You're suddenly branded as somebody who is kind of not within the societal norms and etc. So she had actually put up a lot of that, and she talks about, as a CEO, she had an antechamber. A lot of times she would absorb a lot of things, go to that antechamber, vent out of frustrations, and then come back, compose herself, and then sort of get back at it again, right? So I think very, I would say, clear and present reminder that I think even in today's kind of day and age, no matter how good you are, no matter how high you are, I think, gender bias is something which is a headwind that, women have to face. And the reality is that they have to work really hard to sort of overcome it and yet succeed. And to that extent, it's not really a level playing field. I think this is not a perspective that we typically get, if you were to read the story of a very successful corporate male executive. But I think just by virtue of this being the story from the lens of a woman who rose so high, I think it sort of comes a bit more strongly. I think we all know it intuitively, but it just hits you a bit harder when you sort of hear it from somebody so successful and from the horse's mouth. Yeah. The other thing that I think all of us grapple, especially as we sort of reach towards, the middle of our careers and, middle of our lives, is, how do you balance, right? How do you juggle the various balls? And I think one of the takeaways for me, and I think Indra does make it clear at various points in the book, that in spite of having such a super successful career today, when she looks back, she does have clear regrets in terms of the time away from family that it took for her. Because when kids are young, or when you have parents to take care of, and you are a jet setting corporate professional, it does take a toll. And as glamorous as it looks from the outside in terms of how successful you are, and let's say how financially well off you are, there is a trade-off, right? And the trade-off doesn't make it any easier. Depending on how high in the chain you are, it is as difficult for her as it is for any average Joe. And I think why did I resonate with it? I think it's a realization which is fairly important, that when you over-index on certain parameters, there is something else which sort of takes the brunt of it, right? There is no way for it to kind of look like in balanced scorecard. And I think to be at peace with it, and to realize that that is indeed the case. We kind of all make our choices at different points of time based on different priorities. She also talks about turning down kind of Jack Welch, who kind of offered her roles just because it would have taken her away from her family, right? And being quoted by multiple kind of large corporates, but kind of making that choice at various points of time to ensure that her family is supported. And She also talks about her husband, who, in his own right is a fairly kind of successful professional, likewise making kind of sacrifices and choices along the way, so that as a family unit, they were balanced. I think one of the things that she also makes a very strong point on is on enabling policies which help women stay and succeed at work, right? In terms of childcare, in terms of maternity, in terms of flexible working. And these are all things that she took a lot of effort in instituting when she eventually became the CEO, to fundamentally ensure that, labor participation of women, is secured, and these are key enablers without which it becomes really sort of difficult. And I think because she had seen her journey, in fact, she talks about when her father was suffering from cancer, her employer BCG actually gave her a 6-month paid kind of leave to tend to her father, and she looks back at that with great gratitude, saying if they hadn't done that, as successful as she was, she would have essentially had to step out of her corporate career and sort of tend to her personal commitments. So I think her experiences also made her realize and kind of drove her actions in terms of ensuring that she creates an enabling environment for women, especially, because they, I think, tend to face a lot of the brunt in terms of juggling all these kind of multiple responsibilities, and sort of men do tend to have it easier. But I think all said and done, when you, no matter what pinnacle of career that you reach, there is no perfect balance, and you just have to be conscious of what trade-offs and what prioritization you're doing at which point of time. And that's possibly the only way to look at it. There is no rose-tinted glasses here to saying that, just because you are a Fortune 50 CEO, you sort of had a gala time of it, and, you didn't have any regrets in terms of how things have panned out, right? So I think that was a very sobering thought, I think, amidst, I think, kind of the sheer success that she's enjoyed as a professional, right? Yeah. So yeah, so I think pretty much that. I think, as I said, very, very interesting journey, and I think made it richer by the perspective of, I think, it being a story told by a woman. And I think we tend to sort of overlook a lot of times, what that voice means, and I think it's a good reminder, I think, on some of those things.